I have a friend who, because of her age, was a major in the nurse corps, and she was on ships in which they were returning wives and others who were coming to the United States, and I suspect toward the end of the war, but I don't know. And when she was being interviewed here in the same living room by the reporter, I could have kicked her in a soft place, I'll tell you. She says, "Oh, I had a ball." I thought, what war were you in when you have a ball? Because obviously you can laugh at some of the funny things that happen. War is never a ball. A war's a terrible thing, even when you win them.
Okay, today I'm here with Mrs. Alba Thompson, and she's a veteran of World War II as well as the Korean War. What branch of the service did you serve in during
I served in 4 of them because I was in so early. I was in 1942, and I didn't leave until 1948. And then I had 2 years of reserve duty too during the Korean War. But so that I was in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, then I was in the Women's Army Corps, then I was in the Army Air Force, then Army Air Corps is more correct, and then I was in the Air Force as it is today, because fairly long service. But I did move through those 4 separate ways of dealing with women in the armed forces. There aren't too many of us who can really claim that very early service, of course. Yeah.
How long were you in the service for total?
It was 10 years, yes. Yep.
And your husband was also in the
Yes,
service?
I met my husband in Korea, yeah.
Why did you join the Army in the beginning?
I think it was for the very same reasons that men joined. We were entirely volunteer, of course, whereas some of the men were drafted, of course, too. But I was young, I was healthy, I was unmarried, and I guess you know, World War II was kind of a black and white war. You knew who the enemy was very clearly, and he was evil. Hitler, Mussolini, Tojo, you know, they were evil. And for the same reasons that men volunteered to fight what they saw as being evil. I think that was it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And why did you stay in the service for the 10 years?
I really had very exciting assignments. I was selected for a special course about which I knew nothing. It seemed very mysterious, and you were supposed to volunteer for it and be selected. There were to be only 2 from your total command. There were 11 bases, Army air bases in my command, and so I said, "Oh boy, I think this is to fly jets, so I'll be one of the first women to fly jets." And so I wrote out, in answer to that memo, I wrote out my wish to be considered. Well, there were only going to be 2 out of 11 air bases, and the colonel who commanded the base called me and he says, "I'm sorry," he said, "the letter's already written and I've selected 2 of the men." And I was brave enough at that point to say, "That's hardly fair. I only got that memo this morning." I said, and he was an old cavalry colonel, and he said to me, "Do you have a job?" I said, "Well, of course I have a job, sir." And he said, "And do you think it's an important one?" I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Do you do it well?" I said, "I hope you think I do it well." And he said, "Well," he says, "I'll tell you what I'll do. The letter is double spaced between the names." He says, "I'm going to put your name in between the 2 men that have been selected from these bases." And he said, "And then over my dead body will you go if they don't select you." I thought that was a lousy deal, you know, but it was the best I was going to get out of him. I said, "All right," so that's fine, and I got selected. And now I know very well it wasn't because I was most distinguished or most intelligent or most beautiful or anything of the kind. But what I do believe is, because my first name is Alba, A-L-B-A, that they didn't know I was female. And so I was, at that point, I was simply Captain Army Air Base, you see, Army Air Force. And I'm sure they didn't know I was. And I'll tell you why I know that was true. I might have been, there were only 2 women to go to each of those courses, really 2 schools. and you could have the choice of the finest university in the country. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Northwestern, and there was one other, Johns Hopkins, I believe. And only 2 women in every class. And I was selected, and I know that I was selected because they didn't realize I was a woman, because when I appeared at the first one, which was the University of Virginia, the sergeant who was in charge of billeting us said to me, "Oh, we already have 2 women." He said, "You would be the 3rd, we only have 2 women in each company." And by that time, because I've already told you, I had gotten more than a little bold because I'd already been in service several years, and I wasn't the compliant, sweet little girl anymore, because I couldn't be in the jobs that I had held, in which I had nothing but men in my command. So I said to him, "Well, I'm not about to have a sex change." And he laughed, and he says, "All right," he says, "this is where you will be quartered." And he wrote out the number, and I looked, and it was a BOQ, a Bachelor Officers Quarters. And I says, "I'm going to love it, will the men? I'm going to be the only woman in the barracks." And he says, "Well, wait a minute." So then he had to reassign me, of course, with the only other 2 women that were there in the University of Virginia. And all the way through, they kept saying, "Oh, we already have our 2 women, and you're the 3rd one." So I knew they must have selected me, thinking that I was a male. Yeah.
How old were you when you started?
You had to be 21 to get into the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. You had to pass a tremendous battery of tests. You had to take a physical, you had to take an intelligence test, you had to take a psychiatric test, and I'd forgotten what else, because it was really rigorous. There were no women, you see, in the Army at that point, other than nurses. And it was rigorous. And I had to go to Fort Banks, just outside of Boston at that point, and historic, and I believe it's still there. I think Fort Banks is still there, yeah.
What were you doing before you joined the Army? There was some time
I was a
between
teacher.
A teacher?
I was a teacher, yeah. And I was just out of college, and I had taught only a year and a half, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what were you teaching in school?
At that point, I was teaching English, maybe French and Latin too, but I was in the English department. That was something I cured, especially later on. I didn't want to be an English teacher. I thought I was pretty dull as compared to being a social studies teacher. So, well, I did have 2 major subjects that I pursued, and which qualified me as for a license to be a teacher in the state of Massachusetts.
How did your parents feel about you joining the service?
I never even told them while I was going through all the tests. And the reason I didn't tell them, they were both immigrants from Italy. My father would probably not have understood one of his girls, and he had 4 and 2 males. He probably would not have understood that desire to be in the Army. My mother was a sweet and gentle person, and I wasn't about to tell them that I'd failed in these tests and hadn't been selected until that had happened. And as a matter of fact, I was selected. But my father, who had been in the Italian army, said to me, "Well, you'll never even make corporal," he says, "because we make terrible soldiers in my family." He said, "They stripped the 2 stripes off of my arm because I hit one of the officers over the head with my mess kit." He says, "You probably won't get any farther." So as a result, as I moved through these different commands and so on, I always sent him a wire. Always the wire, which always said, "This 2nd lieutenant just made 1st lieutenant. This 1st lieutenant just made captain. This captain just made major," in order to prove to my father, it can be done.
Now, did you experience any culture shock when you entered the service?
No, not at all. I was always athletic. I was always of the psychology that my father really, by example, said, "You can be anything you want to be if you work hard enough." So no, I was never stopped by any of that. I was quite strong, no. There were very few of us. It was extremely rigorous. It was basic training. every one of our enlisted people, every one of our officers was male because there were no females to do that training. So you can imagine that some of them didn't like a World War II assignment that had them training women for the first time in the history, you see. They weren't cruel, they weren't evil, but I think they would have wished for something else, except that by the end of our training, we were all firm friends, and I remember that the general said it was the best assignment he ever had.
Where exactly did you attend basic training?
But it was in Des Moines, Iowa. Yeah.
What was your specialty in the service?
My specialty became civil affairs. The work with going along with some of the combat units, and after the war it was over, and during the war for that matter, trying to help them to reestablish their schools, their water system, their electrical system, and to, if they didn't have a government, to be the advisors to the government. And in my case it was in Japan and in Korea where I was sent. But I was trained before that. I was not only trained in the University of Virginia, but I was also trained at Stanford, where we took the languages of the Far East, in my case Japanese, and a knowledge of the culture as well as the military strategy that we would employ. We went out as total companies. Again, 2 women in my company. Don't tell me how hard it is today for a few women to be in companies that are all male. We did it, and it was easy enough. No difficulty whatsoever. Actually, I wasn't, the companies were complete, made up of lawyers, doctors, teachers, plumbers, electricians, everything you needed to run a province, depending on how large a company was, or to run a country. In my case, most of my service overseas was with bringing South Korea to the place where we stopped being advisors and then became just people who stood by and helped them as they came to being a democracy and running their own government. In other words, I was stationed in their Capitol building. There again, for a while, there was one other woman there, and she was a Russian combat veteran who came down the stairs with a submachine gun across her chest as I was going up the stairs, and the officer with me, who was American, leaned over and he says, "You are replacing her." And I said, "I don't think so." but it worked out well.
Okay, now I'm going to move on to some more specific questions.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, David.
I'm going to move on to some more specific
sure,
questions
sure.
regarding your experience in the military. Being a woman, what was it like to be a soldier?
Probably not much different than being a male, because I was always assigned to units and jobs in which the men that I worked with and the men that I commanded, that all of them were men, in other words, they're not women. If I had periphery duties like being an inspector for the WAC battalion, that was in addition to my being a supply and maintenance officer. And then later on, there weren't any women to command because I was in entirely male outfits. So I was in Korea. I had a terrific assignment of being the assistant to the chief advisor of South Korea, and the general who commanded that area was in the next office to mine, and my entire office was all males, as indeed most of the command was, of course. Yeah.
Describe your average day when you were in Korea.
In Korea, I ran the office of the chief advisor, and of General Helmick, who commanded the area, and of the Prime Minister of South Korea when the first legislature that they'd ever had came into being, because of course the Japanese had ruled South Korea for 35 years before that. So they were a subjugated people run by the Japanese as part of a military empire, or at least a resource for the Japanese empire. I had very young enlisted men. Now, I wasn't that old myself, but generally speaking, as the war had wound down and we continued with our work out there, out in the Far East, the replacements were very young, sometimes as young as 18 or 19. However, they were very willing to learn, very nice people, and giving commands or having to guide them and so on was a really easy task. The office, just to show you how complicated you might think it was, my files were in Japanese. The one big typewriter that we had was in Chinese characters. The people of Korea who spoke to me and with whom I worked spoke Korean and Japanese at that point too, and we were speaking English for the most part, of course, you know. I was the only one in the office that had a modicum of Japanese, which I had learned at Stanford as part of the military government. It was called a CAT school, Civil Affairs Training School out there, where we had, at that point, only 2 women in the company. It was not hard, it was very inspiring because the Koreans had had a very troubled history, one conqueror after another, and a truncated kind of government under a king and a queen, warring people, all of that, so that as you help them to move toward a more democratic form of government, they worked hard, and they were, you know, the peninsula of Korea was divided into 2, into North Korea really run by the Russians and South Korea run by the Americans in this interim period. Well, of course, North Korea never moved away from communism, which was fastened on them by the Russians, but the South Korea, of course, moved rapidly toward a democratic form of government for which they had no experience. So watching them and their deliberations and their new legislature was a very rewarding job. We worked very, very hard. There were no more than 12 American women in all of South Korea when I began. And I heard the General Hodge say to us at one meeting that when he came into Korea, he had so many thousands of troops, well skilled in all kinds of things, and that he now had something like 15 of those original veterans, and he forgot to tell them that 10 of them were women. Yeah.
Now you were a major at that point.
No, I wasn't until, let's see, that would have been, I would have left them in 1947, I believe that was it. By 1948 I was a major, yeah, when I came back to the United States, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, you explained to me earlier that women were not allowed to be in combat situations. But
no.
You found yourself thrust into combat often.
Yeah, it's hard to tell you what was combat and what was not combat because lines move back and forth, and because ends of wars are almost never fixed as to the date when the war ended, so that you were in a war situation. I myself it was never necessary for me to fire on anybody, but I will tell you that part of my training was to fire and to qualify in all of the arms. And Virginia Britt, who also happened to come from Massachusetts, was the only other woman in my company when we ran problems in the Yosemite Mountains before we went overseas to see how good we could do these problems, and it was to replace the water supply of San Francisco. We had to do that. We were out there for about 2 weeks. Whatever we ate, whatever we did, clothing and so on, we had to carry it in a backpack, and that was it. But they really forgot that we were women, and I have to tell you, they forgot all the way through World War II that women menstruate, and women have children, and women get married, all the usual things that happen to women in their lifetime. So whatever the difficulties, we slept on the floor, we slept in dirty old barracks, you know, alone, Virginia and I, quite often when we stopped into for firing ranges or things like that. But we qualified. We qualified on all of them. And one day, many years later, I was here in this same house, and the mailman brought the ribbons to which I was entitled, but which had never been given to me, because in Korea we couldn't be bothered with that kind of stuff. You know, we were too busy with our work of the day. And my son was happened to be visiting at the time, and he was delighted with one of them. He says, "Mother, I don't care what you do with any of the rest of them, but," he says, "I just love the one in which you're expert in submachine gun." Which was the easiest of the weapons to fire, incidentally.
What was your impression of the enemy, both in World War II and Korea?
That was very curious. By the time I got to South Korea, not in Japan, I went from the troop ship down in Yokohama alone up to Tokyo. And because as they called for us and told us where we were going before we got off the ship, they never mentioned how I was supposed to get to Tokyo to get my orders from the Air Force. So what did I do? I just walked into Tokyo and I got on a trolley. I was the only American on the trolley. My only weapon at that time was a fountain pen in my pocket. And here I was with all of the enemy, you know, surrounding me. Well, 40 had gotten into this trolley. 40 were hanging on the side. 40 must have been on the top of these cars because they were trying to move around. It was, you know, they were distraught. They were prostrate. They had just given up, you see. So here I am, the hero, except that I gave up my seat to a Japanese woman who was very pregnant, had a baby on her back, and she yelled in Japanese to her husband, "Oh, look, this nice lady is giving up her seat to you." And I said in my halting Stanford Japanese, "No, I am not. I am giving up my seat to you. I am not giving up my seat to him." So again, the first culture shock where women were second-class citizens. So this was the enemy. And then I wandered through Tokyo, bombed out Tokyo, where even the Ginza was underground in the underground railway down there. Everything was bombed on the top. Desolate, of course. And I got my orders from, and I was on General MacArthur's staff for a period of time there, assigned to his staff. And then later on, he sent me into South Korea as his liaison officer, and then I asked for a transfer to South Korea because I could see that in Japan, the surrender brought with it a kind of almost subjugation. The Japanese people simply gave up and did whatever they were told to do by the emperor and by General MacArthur, and it was a peaceful kind of thing, whereas Korea was in the throes of moving from an occupied area by the Japanese, where they were always second or third best, to a brand new country that was coming out, and I knew that was going to be exciting. So, and there again, however, some of the Japanese were still there, and I used to watch the women, the Japanese women, because of course they did everything. They were the police officers, they were the teachers. You know, of course, the language of South Korea was Japanese at that point, not Korean. They were only permitted to speak Korean at home or in private. So their own children didn't even know the history of the Korean nation. But I used to watch the Japanese women coming down from North Korea through the mountains on slippers that were worn through, and carrying everything they owned in furoshiki, which is like a big, oh dear, square cloth in which you tied your possessions. That's all they owned, plus their children in hand, small children. And for the first time I realized, this is the enemy? Well, you could hardly think of women sometimes born in Korea, married of course to Japanese, and diplomatic wives, all of that coming down. And do you know, at that point it was something like 15 yen, 15 won to the American dollar, and they were only permitted to carry out a handful of money. Now they were going back to a country they never knew. They were going back to Japan, repatriated. So you got a different view of what war does to some people, and you could hardly think of women with children by the hand with nothing to take back with them, going back to a country they may never have known. And this is the enemy, so you took a different view of what is the enemy, frankly, you know.
And did you have much interaction with the locals?
Oh,
Like
yes.
The average person?
Oh, yeah, oh, yes, all the time. All the time, yes. We lived in a house we liberated, and it turned out it was the house of the president of the Korean Bank. Of course, he had been Japanese. I don't know where he had fled or whether he'd been repatriated, but it was a step up from the previous house where the water didn't run, where the electricity was off most of the time, and I slept on the floor, you know. So some of the women liberated this new house. By that we mean we just moved in without asking anybody's permission, but it was much better, of course. But other than the way in which we lived in this one house, I ate with the Korean people, I worked with the Korean people, and I met the Korean people all the time. I was in their government, and if you would like to see how foolish Americans can be, one time when I got a telephone call, now this is the Capitol building of South Korea, and it's a lieutenant, and he's in the 24th Corps, some distance away, not in civil affairs, not working with the Korean people. And he said, tell me when the racetrack opens today, please. I said, I beg your pardon, this is the government of South Korea you're talking to. And I said, why would you be asking us when the racetrack opens? Well, he says, you have a Department of Agriculture, don't you? I said, yes, we do. And he said, well, he said, they have horses, don't they? I said, yes, we do. And then I saw the connection he was making, thinking because we had horses that we would know when the racetrack opened. And I said, with some asperity, I said, the next time you run out of coffee, call Brazil.
Now, were you able to communicate with your family back in the States easily, or was that a difficult thing to do?
Letters were easy. Nothing else was easy. Even the communications in Korea itself were of the most primitive types. You know, a military magneto-type telephone that didn't work most of the time, and where the stations were named after liquors like bourbon, whiskey, rum. To me, that was always a little humiliating to say, is this whiskey? I'd like to have rum, you know. And then at the minute they heard a female voice, of course, the GI didn't realize he was talking to an officer, so there was always some awful joke that came out of it. Well, I don't have rum today, but how about another choice, you know? You know, but however, it worked, but it took a lot of doing. Of course, we had wireless, absolutely, and remember, I was in the government of South Korea, so that worked okay, but it took days, at least 3 days, even for a wireless to get back. But certainly writing back home was no problem whatsoever. It just took a long time.
How were you received when you returned to the United States? Was there a hero's welcome, or was there just kind of you came back to the States?
No, there were just too many of us who returned. I don't know what happened to those who returned earlier, let's say in 1945. I don't know. But I'm not so sure we thought, or the nation thought of us as heroes. It really isn't like today, where in the war of Iraq, everybody's supposed to be a hero. Well, every soldier is not a hero, as you well know. Some of us were braver than others, and some of us gave a lot more than others. And those who died are in that category. Those who lost a limb are in that category. Those who are stressed are in that category, perhaps. But we were not all heroes, and we didn't think of ourselves as being heroes. We just was doing, we did a job that needed doing, and for which we eventually were trained for. And that was the extent of it. So we came home with all honor, I'm sure, but we didn't really think about how were we going home. Everybody had been in uniform. Everybody contributed to World War II.
Now, did you have any friends back at in the States that were contributing? Maybe not as part of the military, but in
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And some of them were women who later went into service in the Korean War, for example. Oh yeah, as kids they were even collecting aluminum foil, and there were drives for collecting metals of various kinds. Every family had a ration book, so they were giving up fats and meats and rationing gas. Everybody was doing something in World War II, quite unlike, again, the Iraq War, in which you really do not have a sense that you're contributing very much, except for those who are actually in combat, you know, or working in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Okay, the next questions require a little bit of reflection on your experience now. Do you feel that you made the right choice in joining the service?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you will permit me just a little bit of hubris, I find that as I meet with women in the service, and that even applies to some of them today, I think they had just a little more courage, perhaps, than the ordinary woman, because in a very real sense they were pathfinders. They were doing something that women had never done before, so they were finding a way for all who came after that. And you can almost sense that in what happened to them after the war. Those are the women who went into being elected, to being senator or representatives or selectmen at the local level. And they went on into jobs. They broke the glass ceilings in many, many ways. Maybe because they had just a little more sense of the need in their situation as military people, and because they were trained in things that no women had been trained before, so they came out very strong as individuals. So I am sure that that contributed a great deal to my life.
Just to go on the record, Mrs. Thompson has served in the town meeting. She's been a select woman, the first select woman in Plymouth, correct?
Yes, I was the first select woman, the first woman elected as a selectman. I think it only took, if I remember correctly, was it 240 some years before they elected a woman? So they took their time about it, didn't they? Was it difficult? No. I had no difficulty in being elected, and I have run for office of various kinds 6 times, and I made it every single time. And I don't think campaigning is a pleasant experience for either men or women. It takes too much out of you. But as for the work, could I do it? Yes. And I love that quote, and I've forgotten who said it, but they said that women do not have to be as good as men, but sometimes they have to be better than men, and that's not hard.
What was the most life-changing experience from the war, or being in service?
I met my husband. And he was a colonel in Korea and the head of the National Defense Department for Korea before they had Koreans who knew that job. And we had a wonderful and very happy marriage, and had 2 great sons, one of whom is a chief operating officer of the Lexington Institute outside of Washington, and the other who was a captain in the fire department. 2 wonderful young men, and that certainly was life-changing and enriching.
Is there anything that you regret from your experience?
In the military? No. I'm glad that I was selected. I had unusual assignments, even by comparison with other women at that same time. And how about being trained in the Japanese language? How many people do you know trained in the Japanese? Not that I am wonderful, but that it was offered to me, you know, even though there are only 2 women to every class, just like medical schools and like law schools at that time too. I went on to teach Asian studies, and the Army lists me as an Asiatic expert. That's pretty high-flown language, and I'm glad they're fooled to that extent. But isn't it nice that I got that kind of training too? Now, I've been back to the Far East at least 10 times, you know, and I'm at home. I'm at home in the world. I know other people well, and I don't think I have any of the intolerance or the prejudice that some people who live more insular lives grew up having and still do, perhaps as adults. It was, in a very strange way, an enriching experience.
And the times have definitely changed since World War II in Korea. Did you always have a sense of what you were fighting for back then?
Absolutely. We knew exactly what we were fighting. It isn't at all like the Vietnam War, where I'm sure there was a great deal of hesitancy on the part of some of the men as to whether that was a war worthwhile to be fighting, or why it divided our country so badly, why it ended in what some people call defeat. But that was not present in World War II.
Currently, you're very active in the veteran societies here in town. Could you explain your work and what you do for the veterans?
I am the Vice Commander of the Veterans Council in Plymouth. I am, of course, a member of the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. My work is mainly with disabled veterans, but not in the Council. The Council holds all of the veterans organizations together and moves us forward into good areas. That's, there again, very rewarding work. If you want to see where the women have gone, Judy Brown is now the commander, she's female, of the American Legion. Lynn is the adjutant of the American Legion. Her husband has been the commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. I am the vice commander of the Veterans Council. So do you see that in a way we maintain some of our contacts through our veterans service along with veterans? Are there any difficulties? No, not at all. All of that is gone. And women who maintain that they're put upon, that men never quite accept them, and so on. I don't know why that may be so with individuals. It certainly is not so in Plymouth. I don't find that. Never has. As a matter of fact, I like it. Of course, I'm older, of course, than a great many of the veterans, but I like it that when the men come into meetings, very often they'll go over and give me a kiss on the cheek. That's nice, because when I was younger, that wasn't permitted. It's like kissing babies when you're campaigning, you know, that kind of stuff. But what does it show? It shows a tenderness, an understanding. You've been through exactly what they've been through, and they accept you along with everybody else. And that's grand, isn't it? That's grand that we come to that place. Of course there are some people who'll never get over a woman who's made it in business areas, economic areas, elected areas, who rise to the highest places and so on, and maybe they will never get over it. And you know what I say to them? To hell with you.
In your opinion, what is the best way that Americans can honor their veterans?
You honor your veterans by remembering what they need, through their benefits, and through the needs of their family. They gave a lot. Those who lost a limb, those who are impaired forever, whose families will need help all of their lives. That's the cost of war. It's tremendous. You know, when you think in terms of $3 trillion spent on the Iraqi war, $3 trillion? What could we do with an extra million in our town of Plymouth if we had it, you know? Would that make about 43,000, oh more than that, 43 million scholarships for college, full scholarships, if we were to spend it that way. What could we have done socially, in health, in the welfare department, in pensions, retirements, in all of the social problems, in drug therapy? What could we have done with that money, you know? When you think trillions, I can't get above 50 cents without looking at the price tag, you know? So it's mind-boggling that we are spending that kind of money. That, of course, didn't happen in other wars, and maybe that's the nature of this particular war. But it also speaks to some horrendous mistakes made now. What was your question again? I need to be reminded.
How's the best way that Americans can honor their veterans?
Yeah, if you honor your veterans by taking care of their needs of all kinds, and those of their families too.
What would your advice be to a young person today who is thinking about joining the service?
Be careful. These are pretty hard wars that are being fought today. They are far more terrible than in the past in terms of their technological weapons. They are grim. You are always in danger if you are sent overseas. Always. I could walk the streets of Japan and Korea and feel quite safe, but they can't walk the streets of Afghanistan or Iraq. So that anybody who goes into the service today has to know what the consequences to himself and his family might be. It isn't the gung-ho patriotism of some other wars we have known, including World War II, in which I did most of my service, and the Korean War too. So that you have to be very careful about why you are going into service, and don't let it be because you are being rewarded, enormously rewarded, by bonuses and so forth to go into the Army, because the costs can be tremendous. So choosing to go into the armed service at all times is a very serious decision to make, and it should not be made lightly, and for many people, not at all, not at all. So I've always said that. I often have had students who say to me, I'm not ready for college after high school. Would going into the service be a good idea, even into the National Guard? And my answer always is, it's a very serious decision. The minute you go into the National Guard, you are subject to duty 48 hours in the day, it seems like, you know, around the clock. And you may be called to active duty at any time. So consider what you are doing. Don't sell yourself by a promise that you can go to college with a reduced tuition or so on. The price is very, very high. And for some, it's the ultimate sacrifice of life. So it is not an easy decision to make. Now, once upon a time when the men were subject to the draft, you knew a lot of people were going to go in, and you didn't have a choice about that, you know. But if you're talking about an all-volunteer Army, Navy, Marine, and so forth, today it's a different proposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate you.
Oh, sure, David. Hope it turns out well.